Cindy. Hello, everyone. Just delighted to be with all of you and to have this opportunity to speak with Asha Lemmie. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to read her book yet, but it is wonderful. I have been enjoying it immensely and really looking forward to our conversation tonight. We want to let you know that we've budgeted some time for your questions. So as we're going along, if you've got some questions, there is a way that you can do that. If you click on the Q&A option, it should be at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your question there and we'll get through as many as we can. But that said, Asha, let me welcome you to the Free Library and thank you for writing such a wonderful book.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Well, before we get into our conversation, Asha, we would love if you would read just a little bit of the book to us, kind of set the stage for us, if you would.
I think I can do that. So I am going to read just the first page and a half of the prelude. Kyoto, Japan, summer 1948. The first real memory Nori had was pulling up to that house. For many years afterward, she would try to stretch the boundaries of her mind further to what came before that day. Time and time again, she'd lie on her back in the stillness of the night and try to recall. Sometimes she'd catch a glimpse in her head of a tiny apartment with lurid yellow walls, but the image would disappear as quickly as it came, leaving no sense of satisfaction in its wake. And so if you asked her, Nori would say that her life had officially began the day she laid eyes on the imposing estate that rested serenely between the crests of two green hills. It was a stunningly beautiful place. There was no denying it. And yet, despite this beauty, Nori felt her stomach clench and her gut turn at the sight of it. Her mother rarely took her anywhere, and somehow she knew that something was waiting for her there that she would not like. The faded blue automobile skidded to a stop on the street across from the estate. It was in the traditional style, surrounded by high white walls. The first set of gates was open, allowing full view into the meticulously arranged courtyard beyond. But the inner gates of the house itself were sealed shut. There were words engraved at the top of the main gate, embossed in gold lettering for all to see. But Nori could not read them. She could read and write her name, No Ri Ko, but nothing else. In that moment, she wished she could read every word in every language, from sea to sea. Not being able to read those letters frustrated her to an extent she didn't understand. She turned to her mother. Okasan, what do those letters say?
Well, thank you, Asha. And from there, the adventure begins, and you'll see it when you read the book. Before we talk about Nori, who is the protagonist of the story, I want to ask you a question I am sure you've been asked before, and that is about the title of the book, 50 Words for Rain. What's the significance of that?
So, 50 words for rain is an idiom that there are 50 words to describe rain in Japanese because it rains so often in Japan. And I just thought that that was very grand and poetic, and it made a wonderful metaphor for the varying kinds of adversity that Nori goes through in the book and that we all go through in our own lives to a certain extent.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about Nori. How would you describe her?
I think she's a quiet fighter. You know, she is less Joan of Arc and more just absolutely unbreakable. She has a very kind of powerful resilience about her. And I think the fact that she's able to be touched by so much hardship and at times even evil and still remain true to herself as the kind, curious person that she is speaks to her strength.
I'm curious how much of you is in Nori.
I like to say she's the best and the worst of me times 10. She's like a very exaggerated version of me. I put a little bit of myself into all my characters, importantly even the ones that I don't particularly like. I try and always put a little kernel in there, but they kind of always end up growing into their own people, and I kind of just follow where they lead.
Yeah.
With Nori, I can tell you that I lack her patience. And I'm also, for better or worse, not that nice.
Well, you had us fooled. So the story takes place in post-World War II Japan. What sparked your interest in that time and place?
So I've always been extremely interested in history. It was my favorite subject in school. I was always reading history books, and I particularly love the way that the world changed so much between the beginning of World War One and the end of World War Two. You know, in that time period, it was like a rebirth. You know, the old systems of power were largely dismantled. The idea that what you were born as is what you were and what you had to be for the rest of your life was kind of crumbling. There was this idea that people should be able to rise on their own merit. And I've always been really fascinated in what that must have been like for the people who had that power and that privilege and didn't want to give it up. I've read a lot of World War II fiction, but most of it was focused on Europe. And I've always been interested in Japan. I have um, two aunties who are both Japanese immigrants, who were big influences on me as a kid. And so I just I got into learning the language, and I got into spending some time there and researching the culture. And I knew that I wanted to tell a story that was different from what we usually get.
Yeah. Can you give us a little bit more historical context about what was happening at that time? Obviously, World War II has ended, the atom bombs have dropped, Americans are there. What's happening in Japan at that point?
Well, it's just kind of chaos. You know, the average person at that point, and not just in Japan, but the average person really in all of the countries that were involved was really ready to be done. They really didn't have much of a dog in the fight. I think that's how it always goes. The many go to war on behalf of the few. And I think that, you know, when Japan accepted defeat, that was kind of the beginning of the end of the idea of like divine right and imperialism. And obviously, that was the beginning of the road to what we know Japan as now, which is this incredibly modern country.
A lot of the book focuses on the relationship between Nori and her older half brother, Akira. And I'm curious about your interest in exploring the sibling relationship, because it certainly occupies a lot of the space in the book, much more than, say, any romantic relationships that you write about.
Well, I've always been interested in sibling relationships. I wish there were more of them in books, especially brother sister relationships. I think we get sister sister or brother brother, but we don't really get brother sister very often. And so that was just a delight for me to explore. Um, I love their bond, and I love that Akira is kind of prickly and rough around the edges, and it's maybe not the most natural thing in the world for him to be a caretaker, but his love for his sister really causes them both to grow a lot.
Do you have siblings?
I have a little brother, which is a very different dynamic. Um, like, think more slimy creatures in my shoes.
Well, that's kind of standard little brother, isn't it?
He's great now.
Well, I thought it was really compelling, the way that you explored that relationship. And then, thinking about Nori's maternal grandmother, who plays an enormous role in her life. Shortly after Nori arrives at that estate that you just read about in the prelude, we see her being subjected to these painful chemical baths to lighten her skin, essentially to burn the black off of her. And I'm curious, was that practice of skin lightening, was that common in Japan at the time?
Well, I don't mean to call out Japan specifically. The reality is that the skin lightening industry is a multi-million-dollar industry. in parts of Africa, in India, in the Philippines. In the Philippines, actually, they've had to create a task force to try to regulate these skin creams on the black market because they have toxic levels of mercury in them.
Hmm.
And they were killing people, and they were giving people like third-degree burns, and it was just a big problem. Um, there is undeniably this idea that colonialism has ingrained in a lot of people that lighter skin means that you're better. It means you have higher status. And a lot of people consciously or subconsciously believe that. And in the context of this story, obviously Japan was and is largely homogenous. So with Nori obviously having a darker skin tone than the average Japanese person, she's going to immediately stand out. And that's the last thing that her grandmother wants. Now, there are a lot of characters in the story who don't have any problem with her skin color, but unfortunately for her, the person in charge of her as a child is not one of them.
So that leads us to Nori's father, who is African American. He is a soldier, and we know that the Japanese took a dim view of Americans for obvious reasons at that time, and certainly Nori's grandparents went to great lengths to hide her blackness. But I'm curious about how Black people were generally viewed in Japan at that time. Did the rest of Japanese society tend to look down on Black people, or was there this sense of empathy or sympathy, knowing how Black people were being treated in their own country at that time? Because, of course, we're in the midst of Jim Crow back then.
Well, I don't think I can answer that conclusively. I think it would really depend. I have been fortunate enough to have close relationships with a lot of Japanese people, but that's today. And none of them have really given it any thought. To them, I'm just American. You know, it's, I don't really think that they see a distinction like American's American. Of course, there are some stereotypes based off of what you, obviously, if you've never met a Black person, and what you get is what you see on TV, or and then you might have certain notions. But I think that's just really everywhere, that we get our ideas largely from media, especially when we haven't been to a place and explored it ourselves. I'm not sure what the general attitude back then was. I'm sure some people would take a dim view, not only because you would be American, but also because you would have darker skin. And as I said, the idea that lighter skin is equated with status would kind of automatically put someone born with a darker complexion on the back foot.
Yeah. So your book comes out in a year when we have been undergoing a racial reckoning in this country, with support from countries around the world. And I was thinking about that as I was reading the book, the sort of reckoning that's happening in the book and what's been happening here in the United States this year. What did you make of all of that as you were watching the protests unfold, getting ready to release your book into the world? How were you thinking about that?
I really didn't equate them, to be honest, because, I don't know if people realize how long it takes to write a book, but when I really was getting into writing this, like, none of this was happening, or at least none of it was happening in a way on such a large scale. And I was also insulated from a lot of, because I was in high school and then I was in college, so I kind of went from like one bubble to the next, where I was really focused on what was happening around me, like midterms, and I wasn't really watching the news or worrying about what was happening in the outside world. So for me, I admit that the timing is quite ironic, but I could never have known that when I wrote the majority of the book.
Let me take just a moment to remind our audience that if you've got questions for Asha, there is a Q&A icon that should be at the bottom of your screen there. You can click on that and type in your questions. And as I said, we'll get to as many of them as possible when we're finished with our conversation. But Asha, you mentioned high school, and I understand that you started this book at age 16. So you've been working on this for something like, what, 10 years now, right? I'm floored by that you started this at 16. Tell us about your creative process in writing this book.
Well, the truth is that I really, really hated physics. I was in physics my junior year of high school, and I needed to look like I was paying attention, even though I most certainly wasn't. So I was writing in my notebook and I started jotting things down, and I kind of started with this story. It was originally a short story that I presented as an assignment for English class, and my teacher actually called me into her office, and I'm thinking that I'm in big trouble. And she actually just wanted to know how it ended. So that, that's kind of when I got this idea that I might actually have something here.
Yeah, you might be onto something.
I wrote the first 3 chapters in high school, and then I put it away. I didn't touch it while I was in college, but I never stopped thinking about it. I really was wondering what had happened to Nori. I never stopped thinking about it. I would occasionally jot down an idea, but it wasn't until I graduated from college and I realized that real life is, awful, that I was like, I'm going to go back into this book that I love. And so I buried myself in it and I finished it. And it took me about 2 years to get it published, but it was definitely a worthwhile journey.
Just incredible, right? That your first book, your first novel that you start at age 16 and it becomes a New York Times bestseller. It gets rave reviews. I mean, what has that been like for you, the response to this book?
Really surreal. I kind of think that this is a prank. Like, it's an extremely elaborate prank. I'll have to give you that. But this is really bizarre for me. I am kind of still blown away. Like, I wake up every morning and I have to kind of remind myself that this is my life. But I couldn't be more grateful to everyone who has taken a chance on a new author and has let this book become a small part of their lives.
You mentioned a moment ago thinking about Nori all the time, from the time that you started writing this book at age 16. And I often wonder with authors like yourself, do you miss Nori now? There was this sense in which she was living in your head, maybe not unlike the way that she was living in the attic of her grandmother's house. And now that she's out of the attic and she's out into the world, do you miss her?
I don't. She's always with me. Like, I was working on this for so long that I really feel like she's kind of like a metaphorical sibling. We grew up together. Like, it's a coming of age story, the book, but I also came of age while I was writing this and while I was getting it published. I mean, I started as a teenager and now it's come into the world while I'm in my 20s. So I really feel like it was kind of a coming of age for me too. So she's always going to be part of me, but it is fun to see other people's interpretations of her, and sometimes people point out things that I have actually never thought of, and that is part of the beauty of sharing your work with the world. There's some downsides too, but I try and focus on the positive.
I couldn't help but think as I was reading the book and thinking about Yuko, her grandmother, and Akira, her half brother, and Nori herself, that you seem to be a really astute student of human nature. And I wonder where that comes from. I mean, you are still a very young person yourself, and you seem to have a really tremendous insight into human nature.
It comes from not fitting in, to be honest with you. I'm a professional people watcher. And I think people are also less likely to put on a front when they don't think that you're important. So I think, they say if you want to know anything that happened in a great household, you should ask like the servants, because people would like forget that they were there. The servants know everything. They see everything, and I kind of think I have a little bit of that, but I still have a lot to learn, and I'm much more mature as a writer than I am as a person. um Hopefully they will eventually come together.
So you've described yourself as a classical music buff, and classical music has a big role in the book. It's almost a character in itself. I'm wondering, are you a musician yourself?
I am, actually. So I did study the violin, the piano, and I was a classically trained opera singer. I also performed in musicals and did things like that. I love music, particularly classical music. Before the pandemic, I was usually trying to get cheap tickets to Lincoln Center so I could see orchestras and ballets. And I really have a lot of love for that world. And I think it's pretty obvious in the book.
So you did all of that in your copious spare time while you were writing a novel and going to school and starting your career. And by
Well,
the way, I noticed that there is a 50 Words for Rain playlist on Spotify. So I would recommend to our audience to check that out after the interview, with music that is mentioned in the book as well. Um, Asha, what about I don't want to put pressure on you here, but is there something else in the pipeline? What are you thinking about after this?
I'm currently writing 2 books, actually.
Two.
And I cannot promise that either of them will ever see the light of day, but I am working on them.
I could not help but think as I was reading this book, what a great movie it would make. Any possibility of that happening?
Maybe.
We'll have to stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Who knows? I don't even know yet, but we'll find out.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about your characters is that you seem to have a real interest in identity, the whole issue of identity, finding your identity, establishing your identity, figuring out kind of who you are. Tell me a little bit more about that and why that's important.
I think that's such a universally human struggle. Obviously, there's a million different scenarios you could come up with when it comes to, but there's a reason why the coming of age story is eternally appealing, because we all have to do it. Some of us have easier times, some of us have harder times. Whether you're in Timbuktu or Detroit, there comes a moment where you want to know who you are. And there comes a moment where you want to know if you feel like you blend with the world that you are born into, of which you have no say in, or whether or not you feel like you need to break out of that and strike out and find something else. So for me, it's something that I'll never stop thinking about as a writer. It's something I probably will never stop thinking about as a person. And to be honest, I expected to feel like my coming of age story was complete. But it's like every day I learn something different. So I wonder if we ever really come of age. I feel like it's a continuous journey.
Yeah, it's a process for sure. Um, Asha, in the acknowledgments at the very end of the book, you include a thank you to your former self, quote, for surviving the rain. I'm wondering, would you be willing, if it's not too personal, to share with us what you meant by that? What was the rain and what did that represent for you?
Yes, well, I wasn't a happy child. I was really weird, to put it mildly. And that's tough as a kid. I think as a child, uniqueness is not something that one appreciates. You really just want to be like everyone else. And in my case, everyone else was white and privileged, as I was as well, but it's a little bit of a different dynamic. And I really always felt like I was kind of on the outs. I didn't like what I was supposed to like. I didn't look the way I was supposed to look. I never really had a defined social group. Like if you have your jocks and your nerds and I was always like a little bit of everything and not enough of anything at the same time. And so I think I started writing Nori because I was really relating with that feeling of being isolated. Actually, I used to eat lunch in the art room on the 3rd floor in high school because I didn't really have anyone to sit with. It sounds depressing, but that was kind of, I think the attic was really like a metaphor for loneliness. But I think she came out and I came out too, and I am fully on board with the fact that I'm not normal. It's a good thing for me now because normal people don't have New York Times best-selling books in their 20s.
Maybe
So
normal's a little overrated.
normal is definitely overrated, and I'm embracing my weirdness and I claim it as a victory.
That's what I'm talking about. Well, I think on that note, that is a perfect time for us to go to some questions from our audience. And remember, if you've not submitted your question yet, you can click on that little Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type it in there. So let's see what we've got here. A question from Sharon, who says, what is the reason for the self-harm that Nori exhibits in many instances in the book?
Yeah, so I guess that's a little bit autobiographical. That was kind of something that I turned to without even really knowing that it had a name. Like there was a lot of like pinching and like biting and like I it was really just anxiety for me. I think for Nori it goes even deeper than that. I think she lacks the maturity or the worldliness to understand what self-hate really is, but I think her body knows what it is, and I think her body is reacting to a trauma that she is not yet ready to name.
Another question here, this one from Sharon, and not to give a whole lot away here, but she says, I was surprised at the ending of the book and how, I'll say, Nori changes. She is a different person than perhaps we might expect by the end of the book. Can you talk a little bit about, and I'll sort of rephrase this just a bit so that we don't give away anything for anyone who has not yet read the book, but Nori really has kind of come into her own by the end of the book. Can you talk a little bit about that, about her transformation, and was that where you always saw this going?
I always knew that I kind of wanted her to rise, but I also knew that that wasn't going to be completely linear. I think that can frustrate people. They want linear character development. They want people to not struggle with the same things. They want people to not make the same mistakes. But quite frankly, I don't think I've ever observed that in my life. Most people at some point, it's 20 steps forward and 50 steps back. And that's aggravating, but I think it's more real. So I really wanted Nori to feel real.
Yeah. Another question, sort of a follow-up to that from Kenneth, says, thank you for writing this book. It was such a pleasure to read. The end of the book surprised me as to how swift the end was. I had expected the ending to go on for another 100 pages. However, so many significant things occurred in such a short number of pages. Was that on purpose?
So it's so funny that you say that, because I always say that I wish I had an extra 100 pages. But
you always say that you wish you had.
I wanted an extra 100 pages.
An extra, okay.
I did, because I agree with you. It's a little fast. But I think I also wanted a little bit of a jaw drop in a way. And I definitely got it, for better or worse. But, who knows? Maybe those loose ends will be tied up at some point.
Well, and I think that is part of what a good book or a good movie is about, where it's not necessarily just tied up in a nice little bow, and there's, it leaves you thinking, right? And I think that's important. Question from Judith, who says, what authors have influenced you? Any particular types of literature or writing that you enjoy?
So my favorite writer is Khaled Hosseini. The Kite Runner and Thousand Splendid Suns are my two all-time favorite books. I read them at least a dozen times each. So he is probably my favorite living writer. Well, not probably, he is. But as a kid, I was really into the Chronicles of Narnia series. I loved that idea that you could be in the most miserable situation in the world and you could walk through a wardrobe of all things and find this fantastical world. My cat is actually named Aslan. I loved those books. I've read a lot during my life, and I think I continue to gravitate towards stories where people are able to find joy even in the darkest of places.
Yeah, my kids and I read the Chronicles of Narnia as well when they were growing up, and a wardrobe I think would be right on time right about now for many of us. I think we could all use a wardrobe to escape to. Comment from Barbara, who says, what an enchanting young woman and author. I can't wait to read the book. Barbara, you will not be disappointed. Another Barbara wants to know, will there be a sequel to this?
I'm working on one. I can't promise it will ever see the light of day, but I
So
am.
that's one of the two that you're working on currently.
Yeah.
Can you tell us anything about the other one? Any sort of, I don't know,
The other one
general...
is also historical fiction. It is about a young girl who believes herself to be the illegitimate daughter of a very famous writer. And he doesn't know she exists. So she goes on this quest to find him, not only find him, but prove that she is, in fact, his daughter and that she is kind of the heir to his talent and his legacy. And she's a very different protagonist than Nori. She's kind of thorny and prickly, but I personally think that unlikable women are a challenge. And I'm looking forward to seeing what I can do with her.
And it also goes back to the issue of identity that we talked about, it sounds like.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, like one day, if anyone ever sits down and analyzes my body of work, they're going to be like, this girl needs a therapist. There's a lot.
Well, maybe the writing is your therapy, right?
It is my therapy in a big way. Yes.
Yeah. Let me just see what else we have here before I go. Okay, a couple of these questions that you have answered. Here's one from Marcella, who says, hello, Asha. Thanks for the talk and the book. Just ordered on Audible. What has been the response to your novel in Japan?
So I don't know beyond my immediate like found family, and they would never say anything negative because they're so I can't answer the general theory, but I know that my Japanese found family has really enjoyed the book, and they helped me to write it, so they definitely get some of the credit for it.
Yeah. Asha, before we started, you and I were talking about the book, and I was telling you how I just plowed through it, even though it's a fairly long book. And other people have been telling you that as well, because it's such a page turner. But I'm getting the sense that that is not necessarily a compliment, in the sense that an author spends a chunk of her life, in your case, a big percentage of your life working on this book.
It is a compliment, but it's also just a reminder that, it takes years to write a book, and it takes people like days to read it. But, I would rather someone say that than like, oh, this was a slog. I didn't think I was going to finish it. So, but I always say, if you like a book as a reader, the very best thank you could ever give a writer is to just leave a positive review, because reviews can be kind of skewed because a lot of people only bother to leave them if they're very discontented. Think about it. When you go to a restaurant and you like your meal, a lot of the times you won't leave a review, right? But if you hate it, then you're like, this was the worst thing I've ever had. I hope they go out of business. So I always say that if you like a book, just please take 5 seconds to leave a review. It means a lot.
Yeah, well, and I think we can all do that for sure. Judy wants to know, what's your writing process? Do you write every day?
No, I'm not that organized. I'm really not. I'm a burst writer. So like 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I'll write 150 pages. And then that's all you'll get from me for the month. Yeah.
Wow. So so this is not something that's an everyday process. And then I guess sort of the follow-up to that is, do you struggle, as so many authors do, where, you sit down to write and there's just nothing there?
Usually I can force something out. Now, whether it's good or not is another story. But I can always you kind of have to accept that first drafts are going to suck. And that's like, okay, really. You will paralyze yourself if you're concerned about something being good on the first try. It might not be, and that's perfectly fine. If you manage to salvage from that wreckage some decent character ideas, then it was not a waste of time. This is how I have to look at drafting and redrafting. It's never a waste of time, because each time you get a little bit more out of it.
Yeah, well, I think that's great advice for any authors who are in our audience, who are working on novels of their own, perhaps. Thomas wants to know if you have any favorite Japanese writers.
Kazuo Ishiguro. and Haruki Murakami.
And I am not familiar with those names. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more.
Well, I really couldn't do it justice. I suggest like a brief like foray and just read one book by each author and then compare them, and we can have a chat about it.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Got to lay the foundation first.
definitely. They're both kind of into mind bending, which I like a lot. I couldn't
Gotcha.
write it, but it's fun to read.
Gotcha. Asha, if it was one thing that you wanted your readers to come away with, having read this story and immerse themselves in the life of Nori and Akira and Yuko and all of the characters, what would you want people to come away with?
I just think we just perhaps can all work on extending a little more grace to each other. That is something that I'm working on, and I think the world would be a much better place. We all have reasons for why we are the way we are, and I think that one of the things that Nori and Akira teach each other is that if we focus on the commonalities instead of the differences, then the world can just be a little bit brighter.
Well, I think that is the perfect way to wrap up our conversation. I want to thank all of you who have been joining us virtually for being part of the conversation, for the great questions that you submitted to us. We want to remind you that you should be able to see a link to purchase the book if you haven't done so already. foxbookshop.com is where you can get it. FOX bookshop.com is where you can get the book if you don't have it already. Asha Lemmie, it has been an absolute delight to talk with you. Thank you so much for writing this book and talking with us about it.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Well, we so appreciate it. I want to thank everyone at the Free Library of Philadelphia, the author events team who has made all of this possible. Thanks to everyone. Stay safe, be well, and we'll see you next time. Good night.
Bye.